the next speaker is coming from France, from Le Rouvray, and that is Arkadiusz Koselak-Maréchal. And yeah, he is in charge of the abyss in French, and he offers several French terms for that. So the abîme would be the first, but there are quite a few others, abîme, abysse, fosse, etc. So we are looking forward to your exploration of various terms of the abyss in French, Arkadiusz. Thanks for coming. Arkadiusz is a scholar in linguistics, so he's also in connection with James in Rouen and his research project, as well as in Lublin and Adam, so they are part of this real ethnolinguistics groups.
So good afternoon. It's great to be finally here with you in Tartu, in this nice city of Tartu, which I like very much, and with our organizer, Professor Marko Pajevic. My purpose here will be to try to understand how the depths are organized in contemporary French, and the question I want to ask is how the depths are linked with the biblical concept of abyssos, the abyss. James talked already a bit about the French abîme, so I will continue going deeper. My presentation has 3 parts. I will at first explain my starting point, my choice of concepts, and what is essential in the journey we'll be taking together through the holes in the earth. This journey will bring us, I hope, to some basis of what I'd like to call a conceptual geology, or ethnolinguistic geology. We talk about the original abyssos, but is it really original? It can be because the first time when it appears in the Bible, it is in Genesis, and Genesis has written in Hebrew. So we have at first something like tehom, I have no idea how to spell it, which is something like depth and linked to aquatic element. But following some biblical philologists, tehom seems linked to the Babylonian Tiamat, the goddess or the dragon of salty aquatic element, a personification of some kind of primordial ocean. I shall not be engaging in biblical exegesis, of course. I believe Urmas Neumik will talk more about it tomorrow. However, abyssos appears a little more than 30 times in the Bible, and it is often linked with water, at least in the Old Testament. In the French Bible, abyssos is translated by 3 lexemes, abîme, gouffre, and fosse. The closest descendant of abyssos, abyss, is not used, and we will see later why. So what I propose to do, I'd like to ask you to accept to follow me as I trace the lexical path, the journey the word takes, and try to understand how the depths are organized in contemporary French from the linguistic point of view. Let's start with abîme, which is the most frequent translation of the abyssos in the French Bible. Abîme came from abyssos, but indirectly, through Latin. It has a geological, physical reality. Some holes in the earth can be called abîme, like abîme de Bramabio, which you can see on the screen. It is impressive, isn't it? But I'm not paid by French tourism agency, so let's start now to the conceptual abîme. Even if it's conceptual, the abîme is a whole, so we can examine its structure. The first characteristic of non-material abîme is its depth. The abîme is deep, very deep. It can be vertiginous. One can chuter dedans, fall into it, basculer dedans, fall over into it, se précipiter ou être précipité dedans, rush or be rushed into it. But also, we can descendre dans les abîmes, to descend to the abîme. So we have a vertical axe, but the depth is not sufficient to determine the structure of the abîme because it is a hole which can be explored. So we have also something horizontal, and the abîme appears more like an unlimited space, or so it would seem. Regarding to the bottom, its link with abyssos is lost. is lost. If we consider then abyssos is a bottomless depth, one can talk about abîme sans fond, bottomless abyss, without it is perceived as a pleonasm. But we can also talk about fond des abîmes, bottom of the abyss. Finally, it's not so important if there is a bottom or not. The abîme is very deep, so deep that the bottom is too far to be reached. The idea of bottomlessness can also be seen in the frozen expression mise en abîme, which describes the process whereby one image or a story is embedded in the other endlessly. It goes without saying that it has some limits, but those are, like a bottom, difficult or impossible to reach, so they cannot be perceived. Unfathomability is a very important characteristic of the abîme, probably more important than the depth, and it can explain paradoxical uses like in Une voix chante parvient à notre conscience depuis les abîmes infinis et éternels du ciel. A voice sings, reaching our consciousness from the infinite and eternal abysses of the sky. Otherwise, there is, due to his structure, a lack of light and necessarily some black coloring, as in Ces abîmes où la lumière ne perce jamais, these abysses where light never pierces, or Ces noirs abîmes, those black abysses. But here, the darkness seems not to be negative. There is not necessarily something bad in it. It is rather linked with unfathomability and so the difficulties of the exploration. The only limits which are perceptible are those on the ground. The opening of the abîme, which can be more or less wide, so the abîme can be used like a separation, like for example in Un dangereux abîme s'est ouvert entre deux mondes. A dangerous abyss opened up between two worlds. I found few links with the aquatic element, with the verb of movement into the abîme. One can plonger dedans, to dive into, and sombrer dedans, to sink into. But the most often, the abîme is filled with something other. The various forms of matter which can fill the abîme concern above all the psychological domain, as you can see on the slide. And even when it is not psychological, it always has something to do with the idea of complexity. These feeling matters go with the idea of unfathomability and make the abîme close to the chaos. If it's understood like a lack of organization, or rather the organization we can't understand even if we try. Let's now turn to abyss. The abyss is derived directly from the Greek abyssos, but it entered into usage in French rather late, in the 19th century, and with technical geographical meaning very close to Greek, the deepest places in the seas. But of course, in geography, l'abysse has necessarily a bottom. It doesn't refer to particular places which are sufficiently circumscribed, and it is often used in plural. And this, of course, accentuates its blurry character. In the non-material uses, abyss is exactly the same as abîme. It has the same conceptual structure and can be filled by the same form of matter. It looks like a perfect synonym, and we can see it in the examples on the next slide, where the substitution changes nothing. It can be just a stylistic procedure. Abîme is more often used, or maybe the difference is in degree. Indeed, there is an adjective abyssal, which means a highest degree of something, like, for example, bêtise abyssale, abyssal stupidity. But there is no adjective derived from abîme to compare with. While abîme and abyss are very closely related and often confused, the gouffre is different. In French literature, the gouffre is a concept in its own right, often called l'instance du gouffre, the instance of the abyss. We find it in Victor Hugo, Albert Camus, but especially in Rimbaud's poetry. but I will not have time to study it here today. It's enough to know that Baudelairean gouffre evokes notions of death, anguish, time, and loss of certainty. For Baudelaire, on the other hand, it can also be a source of inspiration. From a geological point of view, a gouffre is a cavity in the earth, generally carved by water in the limestone rock, which is characterized more by its verticality and also by its depth. It is also geographically circumscribed and was used to name particular places, such as the Gouffre de Padirac. Etymologically, the gouffre is linked, at least in part, with water. It comes from the Greek via Latin colpos, fault hollow, in the sense of a deep valley or a gulf, fault of the coast. The gulf and the gouffre have long been confused in French. If you believe Ray, in contemporary French, the link with water is lost. In conceptual uses, like abîme and abysse, the gouffre has a vertical dimension and it is deep. It can have a bottom, but it doesn't have to. In this, it resembles abîme. If there is a bottom, it is too far to reach it. The gouffre seems not to have a horizontal dimension. One doesn't explore the gouffre. One can only tomber dedans, fall in, and falling is not jumping. It is almost never voluntary. The other delimitation, like for abîme, is the opening on the surface, which can be a separation. But this opening is very important. There is a very frequent collocation au bord du gouffre, on the edge, on the verge of the abyss. This collocation and its uses tell us a lot about the nature of the gouffre. The gouffre attracts us even if we don't want to go, even if we know that it is dangerous, we go on the edge. To be au bord du gouffre means to be one step away from catastrophe. It is a place in space and or in time for hesitation, and it is difficult to turn your back on the gouffre and depart. It's something we call in French vertige du gouffre, vertigo of the abyss, some kind of ambivalence between fear and desire. And there is also a darkness inside the gouffre. This darkness is there for the same reasons. The gouffre is a hole. But not only, it is rather a bad darkness. And as I mentioned, one doesn't go in of one's own volition, and once someone falls in, it is difficult to get out without some help from outside. I said that the gouffre seems to have only a vertical dimension and is characterized usually by its depth. But there is something more important linked with this dimension. In the most of cases, there is no matter that can fill the gouffre. There is only a void, an emptiness. Because it is empty, the gouffre can swallow everything, and it is almost never filled. This property of the gouffre comes from the depth, but it seems to be more important than the depth. It is if all dimensions have disappeared. Dimensions are secondary, there is only the void that can be filled. It is probably for this reason that the gouffre in contemporary French is specialized with the financial domain. One of the most frequent collocations after au bord du gouffre is le gouffre financier, the financial abyss. Well, there is a plurality of fosses. I choose this image because it is probably the most original one. But let's see different examples. I should stress one point. The fosse is relatively different from the other holes we can go through. I found very few non-material uses in which fosse is synonym with grave. But the fosse is still interesting here because, on the contrary of the other holes, it seems to be thought at first as a human creation, and its special characteristics are linked to humankind. You can see on the screen that the fosse concerns many different realities, natural, artificial. So what's in common in all those uses? Is the fosse deep like other holes? Not necessarily. even if some depth comes into play, as in Faux Lion ou aux ours, the bears or lions' den. Because one cares, of course, that those animals can't escape from their confine. The fosse des onces et fosse septique, cesspool, septic tank, need also to be deep enough to avoid a contact with what is dirty. But this characteristic doesn't seem to be really important. It is mostly deduced. What is important is the fact that in the majority of cases, the fosse has a rectangular shape. It is longer than it is large, exactly like a human body. It enables us to think in terms of the original fosse is a grave. And this is an important point in our subterranean journey because the fosse is linked with death, but it is also linked, as we saw, with dirt, with poverty, and with the unacceptable, maybe even the evil, like in fosse commune, mass grave. So what about our idea of conceptual geology? We saw that all concepts have a spatial structure coming more or less from geology or geography. However, in non-material uses, depth is not the most important. It induces unfathomability in the case of abîme and abysse, and the emptiness of the gouffre. We also saw that the depth implied the lack of light and possibly a black tone. But darkness, in the case of the abîme, is not necessarily negative. Rather, it signifies the difficulty of exploration. This is probably the reason why we find very frequent psychological uses of the abîme. In Freudian psychoanalysis, the unconscious is difficult to grasp, and French culture has been deeply marked by Freudian ideas. If the depths of the abîme are difficult to fathom, like a psyche, it is interesting to descend and explore them. To the extent that it is difficult to understand the abîme, we find the link with chaos. One tries to understand what is not organized, and it is a very human character to do it. The different holes also differ in their axiological orientation, in the values we associate with them or attach to them. The abîme and the abyss are quite neutral. They can be explored. You can get lost in it eventually, but it doesn't represent something life-threatening as such, not even when you fall into it. The gouffre is bad. It is to be avoided. It is synonymous with loss, with something that swallows or engulfs us. It is empty, difficult, or even impossible to fill. Whether or not it has a bottom is irrelevant. Its depth matters, and again, it is rather its filling capacity, therefore its emptiness, that is most important. Se tenir au bord du gouffre, to stand on the edge, is to be really ready to fall in. We can still save ourselves or be saved, even if the gouffre continues to attract. This is probably why the gouffre could have been equated with death due to its attraction, but unlike death, it isn't inevitable. Of all holes in French conceptual soil, the gouffre is probably the closest to hell. You don't go there on your own, unlike into the abîme, you don't think of exploring it. Its spatiality finally disappears outside its edge, and all that remains is the vacuum that it constitutes, or of which it is constituted. The void of the gouffre excludes chaos. On the other hand, when it does not concern the financial field, gouffre can be perceived as a source of existential anguish, of the anguish of death, which approaches hell, but without this proximity being focused. Rather, it is inferred, as in Baudelarian uses. The fosse is a hole, but as a human creation, it doesn't enter into this geology. But the fosse isn't neutral. There is always something in which it is linked with the death, or the dirty, or a danger. Well, what is left of abyssos in French? References to the aquatic element are sometimes found, but this remains quite marginal. Depth, too, is not the most important aspect. The concepts in question focus rather on a certain structure and the materials that fill them or the void in the case of the gouffre. The gouffre is somewhat akin to hell. The abîme and the abyss are more closely related to chaos, but they are neither hell nor chaos. Thus, ordinary French took up, but dissociating them, different characteristics of the abysses and created new ones. Another conceptual geology, even if we find some similarities in other languages, like in German, but the organization isn't the same. Thank you.
Arkadiusz, for shedding some light on the obscure terms in French and the complex relationships between these four notions in French. Are there any questions? Maybe I have a very quick one for giving the others some time. It's interesting for me, and I never really understood that, because you have in French the mise en abîme with an Y, yeah? So, and abîme just with a I circumflex. So do you have an explanation for this difference?
It's just an ancient orthograph.
So it's just conventions,
Yes,
there's no meaning in that.
It's from the older version of French orthograph. And now you can write even abîme without the circumflex accent.
Oh, you can. Yeah. Okay, because I've seen that too, and I was wondering. Okay, so
since 2 years, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I was astonished by one of your examples. Au fond de mon abîme, what a French speaker think or somehow realize about this contradiction of abîme as absence of profondeur, this absence of the ground, and this being or bottom and being at the bottom of it.
Yes, it's very strange because it's the both in the same time, and it doesn't question people normally. It's one or other, but it's the same. In the usage, in normal current French, this isn't the problem.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
I think there should be a reaction on the French as well, but I'd like to leave other people the chance to ask their questions before. Arkadiusz and I often speak together. So I'll come last if there are other questions, first of all. Okay.
Go ahead, James, please.
Okay, while things are shifting. Thank you, Arkadiusz. Thank you very much. I read Arkadiusz's paper about 6 months ago. I see you've made a lot of progress, Arkadiusz.
Thank you.
It was good 6 months ago. Now you've really clarified, I think, for me and Marco, differences between abîme, gouffre, fosse, and all the conceptual constraints there. That's fascinating for me. What I particularly liked, the former speaker spoke about this bottomless aspect. You've explained this, as far as I understand from what you say, it's bottomless because we can't perceive it. And that's reality. It's not simply romantic. It's not simply the imagination. It's scientific. We know more about the moon than we know about the bottom of the ocean. We cannot go there for physical, scientific reasons of gravity, pressure. So these are simply realities beyond us. And I think your explanation of this, your very clear distinction between the different terms and your explanation of the paradox allows us to get beyond paradox into something that makes a lot of sense and makes a lot of sense in French. So thank you very much for clarifying that for me. I've heard you speaking in Polish, of course. I've heard you speaking in French, which you speak perfectly. I've never heard you speak in English, so thank you very much, Arkadiusz, for your efforts.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, James. Any other questions? Well, maybe all the better because we are quite over the time anyway. So thank you very much at this point, and we move on to our next speaker so that we won't get in too much trouble at the end. Thank you.